So welcome all to today's seminar, which is actually the Schumpeter Lecture 2023. We are very happy to have Professor Ed Glaeser with us on the link in the US, and also David Strumsky, who will comment. I will introduce this more a little bit later. My name is Martin Andersson. I'm a professor at Blekinge Institute of Technology and also affiliated to the Swedish Entrepreneurship Forum. I think that many of you know about the Swedish Entrepreneurship Forum, but I will say a few words about the forum anyway. So the Swedish Entrepreneurship Forum is a research institute focusing on research on entrepreneurship, innovation, and economic dynamism in a broad sense. We have three words that we usually use to describe our organization. That is research, debate, and networks. So not only do we do research ourselves, we also try to communicate the research and also try to inform the public discussion and also policy about what the research has to say about issues related to entrepreneurship, economic growth, and economic dynamics. One part, you can see this Schumpeter lecture series as one example of activity that we do. So the Schumpeter lecture series has been around since 2011. Where we every year invite a famous scholar to talk about issues that relate to entrepreneurship, economic dynamics from different point of views. So for 2023, I and the whole Entrepreneurship Forum have the pleasure to welcome Professor Ed Glaeser as the 2023 Schumpeter lecturer. Ed is well known internationally and globally, so world-renowned expert on urban economics and the growth of cities. He's the chair of the economics department at Harvard University and also the Ellen Roglin Professor of Economics. So most welcome, Professor Ed Glaeser. With that, I will give the floor to you, Ed, to talk about cities and its roles for the economy. The floor is yours.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for having me. I'm honored to be giving this lecture, and I'm going to be talking a little bit about topics that were covered in my most recent book, Survival of the City: Living and Thriving in an Age of Isolation, which is joined with the health economist David Cutler. Now, if I were giving a lecture in 2019 or earlier, the theme of that lecture would typically be the strengths of cities. And I would typically start with a graph like this one, which shows the relationship between urban density, both with productivity and with more general population growth. So what you can see here in the blue line is the relationship between per capita GDP and density. Each one of those dots represents approximately 100 of the EU's NUTS 3 regions. And they are ordered on the basis of their density level. For at their hearts, cities are the absence of physical space between people and firms. Cities are density, proximity, closeness. What the blue line shows you is that the densest 10th of Europe's NUTS 3 regions have incomes that are twice as high as the least dense 40% of Europe's NUTS 3 regions, right? This reflects many things. This reflects the tendency of people to move to areas that are intrinsically more productive. This reflects the fact that often more educated people select into denser areas. But I would say after 30 years of economic research, that a significant fraction of this reflects what economists call agglomeration economies. The fact that we become more productive when we are enmeshed in a maelstrom of economic activity. It is the potential of cities to unleash all of our country's economic potential, economic strengths. The red line shows perhaps a slightly more surprising fact, which is the general positive relationship between population growth and initial population density. So whereas Americans at the start of the 19th century, 200 years ago, were leaving their dense enclaves on the eastern seaboard to populate the empty spaces between the oceans, at the start of the 21st century, in the EU as well as in the US, we are, instead of spreading out, we are clustering in. Not only have cities succeeded as places of productivity, but they are also places of pleasure. And I can think of a few more beautiful places to be on a bright sunny day than Stockholm. one way of seeing the impact of urban success as consumer cities is the ratio between prices and income, which you can see for England over here. And in northern parts of England, in lower density parts of England, the ratio of prices to housing prices to income can be below 3, can be below 2 even, right? In the densest areas around London, it can be above 10. This, clearly reflects the demand of people to be in cities like Stockholm or London. And it is just as Dr. Samuel Johnson, who wrote the famous English dictionary in the 18th century, said when he wrote that when a man is tired of London, he is tired of life, because there is in London all that life can afford. Now, before the pandemic, I was pretty convinced that America's largest unsolved social problem was the rise of prime-aged male joblessness. This is also a huge problem in Sweden and in the European Union as well. And in some sense, every unemployed person reflects a failure of entrepreneurial imagination. But the rise of joblessness, and this rate has tripled over the last 50 years. When I was born, roughly 1 in 20 prime-age men were jobless. For most of the past 15 years, more than 15% of prime-age men have been jobless. It is very much not spatially neutral. You can see that on the Eastern Seaboard, where America has its densest cities, you can see in the Pacific Northwest, up here in Seattle or in San Francisco or in Los Angeles, there's very little prime-age male joblessness, because the great urban service economies, leisure, hospitality, retail trade, that employed 32 million Americans before COVID-19 hit, these industries seem to provide endless amounts of employment for people who didn't have fancy degrees. By contrast, in the low-density parts of America, in New Mexico, in Arizona, in a great swath that it can be described as America's eastern heartland, which starts down in Louisiana and Mississippi and then runs up through Appalachia, eastern Kentucky, West Virginia, and ends up in the cities of the Rust Belt, you often have more than 25% joblessness. And in some sense, it's sort of impossible to figure out what less skilled people are going to end up doing in these areas going forward. As a final point on pleasure, this shows the relationship between urban location and happiness. Each one of these dots is a data point for a country. If the dot is positive, it means that the people who live in urban areas and cities say that they're happier than people who live in low density areas. If it's negative, it means that the low density people say that they're happier. It means the rural people say that they're happier. If you look at the wealthier parts of the world, you can see Sweden up here. Sweden is actually a wealthy country where the people who live in urban areas, the people who live in Stockholm, say that they're happier than the people who live in low density areas. In the US, it's actually the reverse. But basically, there's very little pattern in the wealthy world. If you go down to the poor world, there's a huge pattern, and it is overwhelmingly favoring urban areas. And it reminds us that as difficult as we may think a Mumbai slum may be, there is at least the possibility, there's at least the future, there's at least some sort of hope for change, which does not exist in places of unending rural poverty. And it is the ability of cities both to bring joy and to bring the possibility of change. Now, all of this upbeat stuff about cities then runs into this old scourge of urban life, pandemic. Cities have been places of disease for thousands of years. Our first well-documented urban plague is the Plague of Athens, 430 BCE, which is well documented by Thucydides. If you think about the backstory for the Plague of Athens, 5th century Athens, the Athens of Pericles, the Athens of Thucydides, the Athens of Herodotus, really does all that you could possibly ask for a city to do. It is the intellectual capital of the Eastern Mediterranean. It is a place in which connected genius is doing amazing things in the arts, in drama, Aeschylus, Euripides, Sophocles, in architecture, the Acropolis, in sculpture. It is an economic powerhouse. It is a military powerhouse. It still stands today, in some sense, as a beacon of Western civilization. All of its success manages to excite the rivalry of its land-based military rival, Sparta. Now, Sparta has, thinks that Athens is getting too big for itself. It's grown to be an overly tall poppy, if you will, and Sparta demands that Athens stand down from its leadership of the Delian League. Athens, though nominally a democracy, does have a leader in Pericles, and Pericles is unwilling to stand down. He, according to the Thucydides, he has a rousing oration that he summons the Athenians to fight, and he has a cunning plan, which is to bring the Athenians and their allies behind the superior walls of the city, to trust in those walls to keep out the Spartan army, and to send forth the vastly superior Athenian fleet to harass the coastline of the Peloponnesian Peninsula. Now, this strategy is successful militarily. The walls do, in fact, keep out the Spartan warriors, but walls that are good against soldiers may not keep out bacteria or a virus. And Athens, like our cities today, is vulnerable for disease for two reasons. One of which is all cities tend to be the points on our global lattice, the nodes on our global lattice of travel and trade. They are the points of entry for goods, for people, for ideas, for viruses. And so it was in Athens. Some sort of disease crept in through Athens' port of Piraeus and struck the city. Cities can also be vulnerable because of their density, because the same proximity that enables intellectual breakthroughs to be transmitted also enables viruses to move across people. And so it was in the Athens of Thucydides' day. The great historian describes a city that has gone amok, in which people live only for the day because they do not expect to see tomorrow. Perhaps 1/4 of Athens' population dies over a 2-year period. That would be a death rate about 100 times that of COVID-19. Now, Athens does soldier on in the Peloponnesian War for another 25 years, but in some sense, its glory is dimmed forever. It stops being the New York City, if you will, of the Eastern Mediterranean to become perhaps the Philadelphia, to perhaps become the New Haven. It becomes a provincial university town, largely irrelevant to the grand story of the Mediterranean history. This is what disease can do when it strikes a society that is already teetering on the edge. Now, for most of the past 650 years, our world has been relatively resilient to the economic consequences of plague. We have had demographic disasters, such as the Black Death in the 14th century, but we have continued to grow economically. This shows the time series of death rates in New York City over the past 200 years. And what it shows is that in the early 19th century, the early 1800s, during a period of proto-globalization, New York was a killing field, because those global connections ensured that the city was constantly bombarded with different sources of death. In the early 19th century, it was yellow fever. Yellow fever is a mosquito-borne illness. It emerges out of Africa, probably in the late 17th century. It comes over to the Caribbean. Then it ends up striking the cities of the eastern seaboard in the US. You can see that the death rates are about 25 per thousand, or 2.5%. That's a death rate of about 10 times that of COVID-19. And then you have cholera, which emerges in a particularly virulent form in the Ganges Delta in 1817. It gets carried over land with the English army. It gets carried over land by the Tsar's army, and it makes its way to the cities of the West by 1831 and 32. You can see the death rate in 1832 rises to 50 per 100, or 5%, 20 times that of COVID-19. Now, despite all those deaths, the cities of the West continue to grow. And they grow for two reasons, one of which is extraordinary economic vitality, right? This is during a period in which cities are just proving to be engines of economic dynamism, in which entrepreneurs are creating an industrial revolution that would be a watershed in the history of humanity. But it also is a period of rapid urbanization, despite disease, for a second reason, which is that cities came together and figured out how to become healthier. In a sense, this is a hinge of history in which governments stop simply being agents of death and start actually being agents of life. And if we think about, many of our great heroes of European history during the periods of 1300 to 1800, whether or not we're thinking about, Frederick the Great or Gustavus Adolphus, right? They are typically men who are distinguished primarily by their genius in figuring out how to kill other people. By contrast, right, what happens in 19th century cities is that there are also people of genius who figure out how to give life, who figure out how to actually make cities healthier. This happens because ordinary citizens come together and they start investing in things like aqueducts and things like sewers. And you can see here the Croton Aqueduct opening in 1842. These required enormous amounts of finance. America's cities and towns were spending as much on water-related infrastructure in 1900 as our national government was spending on everything, except for the post office and the army. This was an amazing undertaking. It wasn't just about infrastructure. It never is. It was also about incentives that wrap around that infrastructure. You can see that even though the Croton Aqueduct opened in 1842, New York City continues to have cholera epidemics for 25 years after that. My great-great-great-great-grandfather died in the 1849 cholera epidemic. It's not until you have the Board of Health in 1866 in which the cities start becoming healthier. And what changed was that New York had, just like the cities of sub-Saharan Africa today, had a last mile problem. They built an aqueduct, but they didn't actually provide an easy way of connecting to that aqueduct other than using the free hydrants that existed in different parts of the city. Water is difficult to carry, it's heavy, and so poor people continue to use their shallow wells and their pit latrines, and they continue to die. It's not until you have the Board of Health, which starts imposing rules on the tenement owners. It starts fining those landlords who don't connect to the water system, that you actually see the city becoming healthier, that you actually see connections being made to the water system. And this is exactly the problem that we face. I work on clean water in Zambia with actually solving the last mile problem there as well today. It's only when you get those incentives that the city starts becoming healthy. But between infrastructure and incentives, it works, the death rates decline, and we've had an amazing century that's been almost pandemic-free in our cities. And then all of a sudden, this happened again. Okay, all of a sudden, we had an outbreak. This is the death rates in the US as of April 30th, 2020. So this is the immediate pandemic. At the onset, it was a deeply urban plague, largely because cities were the ports of entry for tourists, whether or not they were returning from China or Europe. They came to New York, they came to Boston, they brought the disease in. And during these periods, it really felt urban. Now, an airborne pandemic, as opposed to a waterborne pandemic, is one that can easily spread everywhere. And by November 2020, it was in the Dakotas. Age ended up being a determinant of death. Education ended up being a determinant of death, at least as much as urbanization. Now, within cities, I don't know how many of you know the geography of New York City, but these are the 5 boroughs. This long, slim sliver here, this is Manhattan. This is where the tallest buildings are. These are outlying areas. These tend to be lower density. This is Staten Island, this is Queens, this is the Bronx. Now, you see something striking here, which is the lowest density parts of New York City had the highest rates of the disease. So while I told you that in Athens, the close enclaves led to the spread of disease, in New York City in 2020, 2021, this is not what happened. Tall buildings, skyscrapers did not spread the disease. It still spread in the slums of Mumbai. The remarkable serological work of Anup Malani shows that by July 2020, more than 50% of the residents of Mumbai slums caught the disease, but not in New York, not in Stockholm either, for that matter. Why is that? Because in the densest parts of the city, people change their behavior most. You can see here the decline in trips, in share of people leaving the house, according to the cell phone data. This comes from SafeGraph, where the pings of the cell phones show how people move around. And you can see there are the sharpest reductions in trips in the densest parts of the city, because the densest parts of the city had the people who were in knowledge industries that enabled them to Zoom to work. You can see this. This is that shows the relationship between education and teleworking. Just look at the last column. In May of 2020, at the onset of the pandemic, 68.9% of Americans with advanced degrees were working remotely as of that period. 5% of Americans who didn't finish high school were working remotely. Only 15% of Americans who had a high school degree but no college degree were working remotely. Huge relationship to education, because educated people work in industries that are non-essential often and that can use electronic connections to transmit ideas, to transmit knowledge. This partially explains this fact, which is the relationship between education and the total death rate as of the fall of 2022 from COVID-19. This shows you a 4-fold difference between the most educated parts of America, down here, San Jose, San Francisco, Washington, D.C., very low levels of the disease, and the least educated areas. Now, the impact of the disease on the economy is very much mediated by the evolution in our economy. So if you go back to medieval Europe, to an era of subsistence agriculture, the impact of large-scale death was to increase wages. Because in a world in which everyone farms, or most people farm, having fewer people means having more land per person. And that causes wages and earnings to go up. Indeed, there are some historians who have claimed that the entrepreneurial renaissance that happened in 15th century Florence was itself a result of rising incomes that reflected the Black Death itself. Flash forward to the industrial age, which marked the world during the influenza pandemic of 1918, 1919. In that era, the disease did indeed shut down mines, it shut down factories, but it was short. It didn't do anything to the basic demand for industrial products. And so the economy rebounded swiftly. Flash forward 100 years, when automation and outsourcing has caused many of those factory jobs to disappear, and less educated people end up working in the great urban service industries, where the ability to serve a cappuccino with a smile provided a possibility for employment despite all that automation. And yet those jobs can disappear in a heartbeat if those smiles turn into a source of peril rather than a source of pleasure. Now, when we think about the world, the urban world that we're facing, it is very much a question of what will happen in terms of a world of Zoom. Our cities did survive this, our educated cities survived this in part by switching to electronics. But that switch to electronics has left far too many of our cities feeling empty, feeling abandoned even. This shows the share of people going into their offices in buildings that are handled by the Castle Technology security systems. So this is a security system where people actually swipe in, and it just shows the change in the number of swipes relative to the pre-pandemic period. This shows a more than 50% reduction that has persisted over the last 2.5 years, really an astonishing change to urban life. This shows Google mobility. So this comes from Google's electronic devices, somewhat more representative. Here, the typical number is more like a 30% decline. So it's not quite as extreme, but it's still one in which the hollowing out is enormous. Less of a change in retail and recreation than there was in workplace. So these are just 5 large American cities, more like a 10 to 20% reduction. And indeed, I certainly believe that the pleasures of cities may end up being their safeguards going forward. Even if people don't want to go back to the office, they want to go back to restaurants, they want to go back to cafes, they want to enjoy life with other human beings. The rise of Zoom is not some kind of new thing in the history of urban life. There is a dance between technology and the city that's been going on for millennia. And some technologies, like the aqueduct, are centripetal. They bring us together in cities, they bring us closer. And some technologies are centrifugal. They push us apart. The 20th century, especially in the US, was a centrifugal century in which cars and radios and televisions enabled people to live farther and farther away from each other, to consume large amounts of space, to consume the pleasures of living in a city without actually having to be in a city. And so this technology, which led to a reshaping of life around the car, right, led to what we call sprawl, led to the move to warmer places. This shows the relationship between population growth in the European Union and January temperature, right? Almost everywhere we know of in the wealthy world, people moved away from colder places to warmer places. Indeed, in the US, there's no variable that better predicts regional growth over the past 150 years than January temperature. All of these changes in transportation led to a massive economic shift. In fact, it was an economic shift that was much more frightening than the shift we're going through today, in which older urban industries like automobile production in Detroit or the garment industry in New York were hammered in a few short years. And it really felt as if the age of the industrial city was coming to an end, and consequently the age of the city was over, right? Cities looked like this. This is Liverpool in the 1980s, where it felt like it was just hollowed out. And in 1971, 2 jokers put up a billboard on the highway leaving Seattle to ask the last person who would be leaving the city to please turn out the lights. Because just as no one could imagine Detroit with a smaller General Motors, no one could imagine Seattle with a smaller Boeing. And Boeing, the great airplane manufacturer, had been cutting back on jobs. This is before Amazon, before Costco, before Microsoft, before Starbucks, before a wave of brilliant entrepreneurs had reshaped that city, had enabled it to come back. So in 1980, the futurist Alvin Toffler started wondering whether or not these types of technologies, right, the electronic interactions of his age, would cause the urban knowledge industries to also depart from cities. would cause us all to leave urban offices, to decamp, to move into electronic villages and just dial it in, right? It caused him to predict decades worth of empty offices that would be repurposed as warehouses, right? Now, for 40 years, he was completely and totally wrong. Because, in fact, what happened was that new technologies, globalization, radically increased the returns to being smart, radically increased the returns to innovation. And we are a social species that gets smart by being around other smart people, whether or not in Mike Bloomberg's City Hall or in the Googleplex, right? Knowledge industries thrived on connection. They thrived on allowing people to learn from one another. If electronic interactions were making face-to-face interactions obsolete, why would the most famous geographic cluster in the world be Silicon Valley? Why would Google, prior to 2019, which of all the companies in the world should have been able to manage long-distance work, why did it actually specialize in bringing people together, in creating these offices where their young people would be right on top of each other as often as possible? One of the reasons for this is the world became more complicated, right? And the more complex an idea is, the easier it is for that idea to get lost in translation, right? We have evolved over millions of years for having cues for communicating comprehension or confusion that are lost when we're not in the same room with one another, right? Face-to-face contact enables that to work. But it works much better if you're well educated. And so the cities of America that were educated came back. The cities that were not educated continue to decline. This shows the relationship between share of the population with a college degree in 2000 and per capita GDP. Enormously strong relationship. Again, about a 4-to-1 ratio between the least and the most educated areas. This is not just about the fact that your education makes you more productive. It's about the fact that your education makes your neighbors more productive. It's what economists call human capital externalities. A typical fact is that as the share of adults in your metropolitan area goes up by 10 percentage points, your earnings also go up by 10%, holding your years of schooling constant. Because having skilled neighbors means that you have people that can give you a job, people that can buy from you, people who can sell to you, and people, most importantly, that you can learn from. They provide what the great English economist Alfred Marshall was talking about when he wrote in the 19th century, that in dense clusters, the mysteries of the trade become no mystery, but are, as it were, in the air. This shows the relationship between share of the population with a college degree and subsequent population growth, a 4-fold difference. Now, and this is why this is the Schumpeter lecture, right? The skills that matter most for cities are really not the skills that are learned in the classroom. They're the skills that are learned in the cluster. They're the skills that are learned at the water cooler, at the breakfast table, at the cafe. And I can't think of a skill that is more important, that is more central to urban resilience than the talent and ability to be an entrepreneur. 60 years ago, the economist Benjamin Chinitz was comparing New York and Pittsburgh and noting that New York was more resilient than Pittsburgh was even then. He argued that this was a result of New York's historic garment sector, the largest industrial cluster in the United States in the 1950s, right? The thing about garments is that there were few barriers to entry, few returns to scale. And so anyone with a sewing machine and a good idea could get started. And so it was a mother of entrepreneurship. And I'll return to that in a second. By contrast, Pittsburgh had US Steel. US Steel had vast returns to scale, right? And US Steel trained company men. Those company men were great at short-term logistics, but they were not entrepreneurs, and they could not turn Pittsburgh around when the steel industry faltered. It is amazing that given how weak our measures of entrepreneurship are, right, how imperfect they are, that they do such a good job of predicting urban dynamism. This shows the relationship between average establishment size, going from the 1, which are the places with the smallest average firms, to the 5, which are the biggest, shows the relationship between firms and percent growth in employment. So this is 180% growth in the smallest firms, and this is 30% growth. Huge connections. The stories that we hear about urban rebirth just back this up. So I'm just going to give you 2 people who start in New York City's garment industry. This is A.E. Lefcourt. He features in my first book, Triumph of the City. A.E. Lefcourt starts doing, actually, he makes cloaks, he makes capes. He becomes a clothing entrepreneur. He then gets into banking, and then he ends up building more skyscrapers than any other New Yorker did in the 1920s. You can find Lefcourt buildings all around New York City because his entrepreneurial talents, which he honed in garments, were perfectly transferable. It enabled him to find opportunities somewhere else. This character may be more famous to you. This is Samuel Goldman. Again, gets his start in clothes. In his case, it's gloves. He goes on to be an entrepreneur in the nascent film industry, and his name still graces Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer. Now, I'm going to give you a bit of data here. So sorry about the sort of nerdy nature of this, but this is average establishment size and employment growth among large cities between 1980 and 2002, again, showing this basic pattern. This is another measure that we have. This is the average amount of employment that's in new startups, again, showing this positive effect. This is just meant to give us our basic facts. And I'm going to show you how robust this is to different things. So here we're going to show you cold cities and warm cities, and we're going to show you this by different forms of employment. So this is not looking at the total city other than the first line. This is looking within individual clusters. So this is within mining, construction, manufacturing, within trade, finance, and services. Low agglomeration industries, these are industries that are everywhere. High agglomeration industries, these are industries that are in a few places, right? High agglomeration, trade, financial, and services. Everywhere you look, small dynamic firms make for growth. Here we try and deal with a possible causal problem that, maybe other variables explain why we have both growth and lots of little firms. So we follow the logic of Chinitz's story. We follow the logic that places that have natural resources, iron, lignite, coal, end up having large manufacturing firms 100 years ago. These then translate to having large companies and large companies that service those companies, large law firms, large accounting firms. And that ends up creating a less entrepreneurial culture. And so this is our basic model. You can see my clothing guy makes a reappearance here. So here we've got Pittsburgh, that's got these heavy, the steel industry. New York City, none of that. You've got a clothing industry. This creates our budding company man. This creates our budding entrepreneur. And this then explains this. So that's our story. So here we use the variation in IV 250 and IV 500 shows the variation that just comes from the presence of these historical minds. And you can see here the results are really quite similar. The reason why we focus here are these are just trade, finance, and services, and these are ones that are concentrated. So these are export industry ones, not ones that are ubiquitous. You see the same basic patterns. Where you've got lots of minds, you end up having larger trade, finance, and service industries, which end up being less dynamic, less successful going forward. In some sense, this is the old familiar natural resource curse that ends up creating big firms that stymie local entrepreneurship. This shows our basic effects, adding a whole lot of other controls, right? Controlling for manufacturing, controlling for region. They also the same basic robustness that entrepreneurship is associated with success. Okay, pivoting back to what we know about productivity during the pandemic. So I argued sort of somewhat bombastically that I thought that face-to-face contact, in the past 20 years, past 30 years, had not been made obsolete. What about now? Maybe Zoom has made this obsolete. Well, turns out we have a bunch of evidence on remote work and that suggests that while in many cases it can create static productivity gains, it also comes with long-term dynamic losses. A major paper written by Nick Bloom in 2014 on remote work, which looked at Chinese call center workers, is echoed by more recent work by Natalia Emanuel and Emma Harrington, looking both before and after the pandemic at American call center workers at a large retailer. They both show exactly the same thing. These call center workers can make just as many calls when they're remote, but their probability of being promoted drops by over 1/2, right? So they're able to call, but they don't get moved up the hierarchy. Why? The most natural explanation is they're not learning how to handle the difficult calls, because that's what it takes to be promoted. Or their bosses aren't learning that they're good at handling the remote calls. You've shut down the learning channel that operates when we're next to one another. And so you've locked them in place. You've turned them into a fixed thing rather than a growing thing. This comes from Microsoft work. I'm just going to read you from the abstract. They looked at sort of all the interactions within the company. Our results show that firm-wide remote work caused the collaboration network of workers to become more static and siloed, with fewer bridges between disparate parts. Furthermore, there was a decrease in synchronous communication and an increase in asynchronous communication. Together, these effects may make it harder for employees to acquire and share new information across the network. Third fact, this shows at employment and postings on Burning Glass Technologies. That's an aggregator that looks at basically all of the online job postings in the US. What you can see on your left is for jobs that had to be done live. So this is working in the construction industry or working in retail trade. Employment falls down when the pandemic starts, and then it comes back up. Postings fall down, and then they come back up. By contrast, for the remotable jobs, for financial services, for any number of information work jobs, employment stays rock steady. New postings plummets by 40%, and it stays down for almost 2 years. Now, what's going on? I think the most natural explanation, which I've heard from companies throughout the world, is they did not want to onboard new workers when they would not actually see the workers physically. They could not bring those workers into their corporate culture. They could not ensure that they would learn how that company did business. Going remote shut down the learning channel that is so intrinsic to creativity, that is so intrinsic to dynamism. Fourth piece of evidence, remote teaching. We now have a lot of evidence from schools throughout the world on what remote teaching does. And by and large, it is somewhere between catastrophic and disastrous. Our young people, when they are asked to learn remotely, learn nothing, right? Again, turning down the sort of rich emotional bonds that happen when we're in the same room with one another. So when I think of the future, when I think about the entrepreneurs of the 21st century, I don't believe that entrepreneurial hungry companies are likely to be very satisfied with, going remote and staying remote. But I do think they have become more mobile than ever, right? Because they can easily imagine just connecting with their venture capitalists, connecting with their attorneys, connecting with whoever they need via Zoom, even if they're going to want to be next to each other. So what that means is not an end to the offices of the world, right? Some kind of offices are likely to exist, but it does mean that every city is going to have to fight harder to retain global talent. In some sense, for those of you who are entrepreneurs, rather than being in the city business, this is actually good news, that once cities get their act together, they're going to realize how precious entrepreneurs are and that they're going to have to fight harder than ever to try and get them. That's going to mean that they're going to need to return to the basics of city government, right? In some sense, all cities are built on a triad. There are three things that are intrinsic, one of which is the economic magic of interactive entrepreneurship, whether on the small scale or the large scale. The second of which is dealing with the downsides of density, crime, contagious disease, traffic congestion, high housing costs. And the third part of the city, and in my view, it's actually the least important, is actually the physical city, the physical infrastructure, which is often confused for being the real city, but the real city is flesh and blood, not the buildings that house that flesh and blood. Entrepreneurs have the ability to change cities, right? 10 years ago, 15 years ago, there was a big amount of excitement about the so-called sharing economy, as if that was new, right? Companies like Airbnb and Zipcar, which entrepreneurs brought out so that people could actually share more things. But cities have always been about sharing. What is a restaurant other than a shared kitchen, a shared dining room? What is an urban park other than a shared yard? The difference is that these technologies enabled us to share more things. They enabled our cities, in some sense, to become more truly what they were always meant to be. But the big question is, as vital as entrepreneurs are for cities, right? Can governments actually manufacture entrepreneurship? They can certainly repel entrepreneurs. They can certainly stop entrepreneurship, but can they actually bring it in? This is Walker's Wagon Wheel, which is in some sense a magical meeting place for entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley in the 1960s. And those entrepreneurs, precisely because there were so many of them, and they competed so furiously, as well as occasionally sharing ideas, were able to completely dominate the East Coast version, the Route 128 cluster, typified by Raytheon's corporate campus here. Government can certainly stop entrepreneurship. One of my pet causes was to fight to reduce the regulations that stop urban food trucks in the U.S. This was a food truck called the Pink Flamingo, which was trying to get started in Detroit, one of America's more troubled urban areas. Unfortunately, after a year and a half of starting, the Pink Flamingo was unable to get its permits. And it is sort of crazy that a city like Detroit is making it difficult for entrepreneurs to actually get started. And yet in the US, and as in many parts of the world, we have far too many rules that protect insiders at the expense of outsiders. When I look forward at one of my hats right now, is I'm working together with Ian Golden and Lord Norman Foster on a plan for Kharkiv post-conflict. Technology entrepreneurs, at least for us, play an outsized role in this, right? Thinking about the role that entrepreneurs can play, not just in Stockholm's future, but also in the future of Kharkiv and Kiev. And for us, at least, the universities in Ukraine feel like they are a central asset. So this just shows the clustering of science firms in Boston. This is the Route 128 cluster that I just mentioned. This is Harvard and MIT, right? And you can see the tech clusters really clustered around MIT. Well, Kharkiv also has an ancient technology university hub that we think is also a potential hub for this. Unfortunately, There are far too many barriers to entrepreneurship in Ukraine. There are far too many things that are difficult to actually get done. And in some sense, creating an entrepreneurial-friendly Ukraine, just like creating an entrepreneurship-friendly US or an entrepreneurship-friendly Sweden, is one of the biggest things facing the future. I'll make one more comment, and then I'll wrap up. One of the things that I am most concerned about is the gender gap in entrepreneurship. And I've done work on this in Africa with Nava Ashraf of ALSE and Alexia Delfino of Bocconi. This just shows from the World Bank Enterprise Survey the share of entrepreneurs who are women. In some parts of the world, this reflects culture. In other parts, it reflects weak rule of law and the fact that many female entrepreneurs are preyed upon by men. But in fact, ensuring that entrepreneurship isn't just about success, well-educated white males is absolutely crucial going forward. And this really requires an entrepreneurship agenda that is really wildly inclusive. I believe very strongly that the cities of the world depend on their entrepreneurs. I thank all of you who are interested in your entrepreneurs and are interested in Swedish entrepreneurship or are doing your own entrepreneurial activities. And I just want to end with this sort of optimistic photo that, cities have been through much worse than what they've been through right now. This is Milan in 1943 and Milan in 2014. They will get through this as long as they are blessed by people with energy, people with entrepreneurial spirit, who can create their dreams by connecting with other human beings in the cities of the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ed. It's a very inspiring talk, and I think we all very much appreciate the take you have on cities, and I'm also look forward to think more about cities and especially the role for entrepreneurship. With that said, I will leave the word now to Debbie Stromsky. You are professor at Jönköping National Business School since September. Since September, so it's quite recent. And you have a background in the University of Arizona in the US, and have also done a lot of work on cities and especially on invention, innovation, and explain the geography of innovation, those kinds of phenomena. So I welcome you up to provide some comments and reflections on Ed's presentation, and we will open up the floor for some overall discussions afterwards. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you. And I want to thank everybody so much at the Swedish Entrepreneurship Forum for inviting me. I greatly appreciate it. I have my notes because I want to make sure I have the statistics correct. I have been cyber stalking Ed Glaeser for a couple of weeks now. And it was an exercise in humility, let me tell you. 164 NBER articles. Google Scholar, 130,000 citations of his papers and books. His H index is 144. Ideas has him at 169 published articles, 6 books, and those don't include the ones that he contributed chapters to. Ed Glaeser needs no introduction. His work is phenomenal. But what was interesting to me when I cyberstalked it was how many of the websites actually alluded to his mentorship. And I thought that was really interesting. And it comes back to I met Ed for the first time when I was a master's degree student presenting at a conference. It was my first year doing my first year in my master's degree program. Come on, if you're a master's degree student, you haven't learned anything about the literature. You're just struggling to get some of the initial courses out of the way. You're completely helpless. And we presented a paper where we were doing some decomposition with the Cobb-Douglas production function. And a professor who shall remain unnamed was sitting right in the front. And it was somebody who's much older, very stern, to be a little bit of a curmudgeon. And he's like, you can't use that paper. You cannot use that model that way. Growth accounting is done this way. We weren't doing growth accounting. And Ed was off on the side and said, whoa, hang on. Let's just see what they did. Come on, let's just see what they found. Don't worry about it. And it was amazing that the person backed off and, okay, you could tell it was a deep affront to him to use the model this way, but that's what happened. My first thought was, oh my gosh, this guy is so cool. No, that was my first thought. My second thought. My first thought was there was this young, attractive professor. I'm like, he can't be an economics professor. He's way too well dressed. And I'm like, maybe he's got to be. Maybe he's from finance or banking and he just wandered into the wrong session. Okay. But what struck me at the time as a young person coming up, going to the first conference, I was utterly terrified, was that this professor here, who everybody in the audience knew but me, because it was my first venturing out, was that academia really was about the exchange of ideas. It's not about making sure somebody retread a canon. And I will come back to this point when I end my little talk. But that kind of mentorship, that got brought up again and again in the research on ed. And it certainly made me an addict and made me want to go back and become an academic, to go on to a PhD. So thank you, Ed Glaeser. It's greatly appreciated. Now, one thing that Ed has done here as a setup, which I think is so important, and maybe in economics, because we're so tied to the data and the empirics, that sometimes we forget to look at the long, deep histories. The history of humans is the story of urbanization, is the story of humans and human evolution. It really is. And it was not a trivial thing to have humans learn to live in groups that were beyond the family unit or beyond a tribe, because historically we like to kill each other, as many species do. We're very territorial. So taking that long, deep history is really, really important. And I absolutely agree with Ed. Cities are here to stay. I know we've had COVID, but Stockholm lost about 40% of its population during the Black Death in 6 months. And I'm sorry, I've looked at your apartment leases. There is there's plenty of demand for living in Stockholm today, and that isn't going away anytime soon. Cities aren't phenomenally resilient. They're not going away. He's absolutely right. Why? And as he alluded to, cities are miracles of social learning. Absolutely phenomenal machines at doing that. And when I was listening to a talk that, an interview that Ed gave, he alluded to cities as this exchange of people and information, and Socrates and Plato arguing on a corner in Athens. And I was like, you know what, that reminded me so much of Lucas when he pointed us to Jane Jacobs and the role of cities that Jane Jacobs illustrated for us. And he was talking at that point about urban density and closeness. And he's alluded to it in this talk here as well. But it's not just closeness. More of the same in a small area doesn't get you a city. That's not what cities are about. And often when people talk about density, they're like, well, it's just, you put people together and it's like billiard balls on a big table. They collide with one another. There's some hand waving about Brownian motion and density. And then we kind of wash our hands and walk away. But it's so much more than that. It's so tricky. And I want to actually say we need to take what are the mechanisms that are happening in the city that make cities what they are. So Mark Twain has a great quote, and I want to read this exactly because I want to make sure I quote him right. Mark Twain says, travel is fatal to prejudice, bigotry, narrow-mindedness, and many people need it. And they need it sorely on this account. A broad, wholesome, and charitable view of humanity and things cannot be acquired by vegetating in your small corner of the world. Cities are the social transport mechanisms. They accomplish the same things that an individual traveling manages to do. That's what they do. They take us out of our small world and they show us a much broader world. They reduce our prejudices. They reduce our bigotry. They open our minds. Okay. We see new cultures, new opinions, new ideas. Now, this grand collision of diversity, that is the key. That is the engine of human evolution. And I will say human evolution, not just human social evolution. That grand collision is evolution. It's what allowed us to, we are taller, we live longer, we are healthier. Cities and the things that are produced in cities, that was key to doing it. So that said, It is the diversity, it is the combinatorics of those collisions that are critical. It's a second order effect. Learning doesn't happen in a homogeneous setting. They don't happen in homogeneous echo chambers. Learning requires diversity. Cities say to people, they ask us to be ourselves, which is kind of amazing because there's an idea that if you take a person and you bring them to the bright lights in the big city, the person's somehow altered. The person is not altered. The only thing a city asks of us is to be ourselves. Think about that. If you are into crazy things, if you seek the bizarre, the extreme, the unusual, the novel, the city is where it's at. What the city is doing is this magical sorting and matching process. And for anybody who has ever done a matching pair experimental design, you know how hard that is. So cities are doing this in real time constantly. They're saying risk takers, come in. People that are not risk takers, maybe you can't deal with being uncomfortable or the new, maybe the suburbs or a rural area is good for you. We take in the risk takers. We take in the people that are looking for the extreme, that want access to niche markets and want to be entrepreneurs creating niche markets. And that is part of the magic of the cities, the sorting and matching machine. Now, if we have all the, it sounds like a wild, wild west. It sounds like it's a crazy place. And like I said, when you put all these people, different cultures, different ideas, different belief systems, that close together, they don't, again, historically, we like to shoot one another who is not kin to us, right? But in the cities, what happens? I'm sorry, that person that at first might seem very intimidating, maybe they do have skull tattoos on their face and 4 nose rings, and they're a little intimidating at first. But you know what? You're sitting next to them on the train every day. And they go from being scary to being kind of amusing, a little entertaining. And then when you're both standing in the rain waiting for that late train, they become human. You have empathy with them. You recognize them. There's a sympathy of human existence and suffering while you're waiting in that January rain, trying to cross an icy street together. We recognize each other. That empathy allows us to learn and collaborate with one another. And you need the diversity, you need that empathy that comes with these continuous collisions and becoming comfortable with the unfamiliar. And cities have a rare way of doing that. So once we have that empathy, once we are comfortable with the unfamiliar, we can collaborate. And when we collaborate, man, we invent because A, we're bored easily. And frankly, when you start exchanging ideas, as humans, we can't help ourselves. It's what we do. I think some of Robert Boyd's work and Joseph Heinrichs out of Harvard, Rob Boyd's at ASU, have some phenomenal work on this. I think their work is great and they don't get enough credit. So cities are this, so I'm sure you can see, saying cities are this almost mystical places of these human combinatorial collisions. But now I'm going to put on I'm going to be a Robert Gordon to Ed Jolmokier. And going to do a little bit of a correction here. When I look at invention in urban areas, and you look at what is happening over time. So we're looking at scaling. So we're looking with, as you double the population, what kind of increase do you get in invention rates? And cities get, you double the population, you get more than double the disease. You get more invention, you get higher wages, you get all of these things. So you get more of the good, but you also get more of the bad. But let's look at the invention in cities and see what happens. In the city, in the 1970s, so we take the 70s decade, with every doubling of city size, you get a 1.14 scaling coefficient. So you get 114% back. With every doubling of city size, you get 114% increase in invention. In the 80s, it went from 1.14 to 1.32. In the 90s, it became 1.34. in the 2000s, the first 10 years of the 2000s, it went to 1.36. And between 2010 and now, the most recent one is 1.42. So I get a lot of questions about, as Zoom was coming up, the technology was coming up, going, is it going to just displace cities? No, in fact, the premium to cities is going up, not down. So cities, resilient technological change, but now what's happening where we are now? And this is why I said the Robert Gordon. We are increasing our R&D spending. Almost all of it goes to metropolitan areas. It goes to cities. So what is happening is a question. We are spending more and more and more. Are we seeing diminishing marginal returns to investment in research and development? And if so, why? This is a big question. Are we seeing a decline in our innovativeness, and not just in one country, but around the world? Maybe China is an exception because they are coming up. But this is certainly a big question. Diminishing marginal returns to our innovation investments. Modern growth theory was based on the notion of spillovers. And that's the whole idea of cities. This is agglomeration, this is spillovers. But I don't care how much you crowd us in this room, if we're all very homogeneous and everything you tell me is something I already know, no matter how much we collide, it's not a spillover. I already knew it. So what I'm very concerned about is the segregation and the homogeneity that is being built into the systems. That's the way the system seems to be evolving. And that is a great concern. So are we segregating people in cities? Is there less mixing, fewer opportunities for those Jane Jacob-like interactions to occur? If you don't venture out of your neighborhood, or in the United States, you do venture out of your neighborhood, you get shot. It's a bit of an issue, right? We need those diverse collisions to happen, but segregation reduces the number of the collisions that can actually produce the spillovers. Number two, are we segregating knowledge creation? Part of what you look at when you look at the invention record in cities is that the top 5 are getting a larger and larger proportion of the invention. And the top 5 cities are, not only are they taking more of a share, the distance between them and the lower tiers of cities are getting farther and farther apart. So we're seeing this rarefication. Now that's lovely. If you're in Palo Alto, I'm from the Boston area. If you are in the Boston area, it's being around Cambridge, Harvard, and MIT is awesome. It's wonderful. And it's great if you're there. But what does that mean for where knowledge creation centers are, if that's where we're pushing everybody and it's being removed from the production process, if it's being removed from these other cultures, from these other places where these other ideas are generated, are we actually abandoning our learning by doing spillovers, or the innovations that come from having the knowledge creation more distributed, more evenly distributed spatially? So I'm a little bit worried about what's happening with learning by doing. And finally, I hear so much about entrepreneurial ecosystems, about innovation ecosystems. But if you look at what a natural ecosystem does, where we're pulling from, ecosystems generate diversity. But the way we're focusing, what will we invest in? Who should be in these centers? Who should be doing the knowledge creation? What kind of invention do we want to pay for? Right? We are creating a monoculture. In the invention record, when you look at the technology space, what we're seeing is the technology space has the potential to grow because we are seeing the space is increasing. We are exploring less and less of it. We are doing more refinement in the technology space, which means we are improving technologies we have, and it's more and more concentrated in larger firms that are chasing the same clusters of technologies. And so you have to wonder, what have we given up as we look at these monocultures of really big firms producing a not as novel set of technologies? Have we, in the pursuit of the next iPhone, have we given up a potential solution to Alzheimer's disease? And that is why I want to come back to one thing about Ed that I also found when I was doing my homework. And that is, he is absolutely fearless in his research agenda. There wasn't a subject that he didn't tackle. I mean, he was absolutely fearless. He tackled religious affiliation, immigration, segregation, race, that the diversity of the questions and the type of insights he was generating was the kind of knowledge creation that we need more of, that open exchange of ideas that we need not only in academia, but we need it in our cities, that openness to diversity. And I for one, am grateful that he's out in the world. And thank you.
Okay, thank you, Debbie. So, Ed, do you want to comment or discuss?
Well, that was about the kindest and most generous discussion that I've ever received in my entire life. So thank you, Debbie. I don't know what else to say, but it was both beautifully done and incredibly kind to me. And you've made my week. So thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so I actually have a few questions myself that I want to pick up on. One relates to Debbie's point about homogeneity, and I wanted to go back to the issue in the end of your lecture, Ed. You were saying that you were asking the question: can governments manufacture entrepreneurs? And the way I understood you was basically you talked about the role of an entrepreneurship-friendly environment, and I know you have been done a lot of work about this. But my question is, so when you say can governments manufacture entrepreneurs, I mean, one thing you can talk about is, let's say, the general framework conditions, and those are typically determined at the national level. Well, Sweden is a non-federal state, used as a federal state, so maybe the states have a little bit more say in the US. But over and all, I mean, things like labor market regulations, tax systems, and so on, they are determined by the national rules and the national framework conditions, and they sort of impose restrictions on cities. So I would like to reflect a little bit on or articulate what in your view are the things that, let's say, local governments are typically in charge of and actually is part of, let's say, what you can call the entrepreneurial, the framework conditions for entrepreneurship. I mean, you have zoning regulations, you have housing, you have the use of land and stuff like that. You gave some examples about the regulations concerning these. Was it pink buses or purple buses? I don't remember.
The bus is called Pink Flamingo, but the bus itself was not pink. The bus was
Pink Flamingo.
Was chrome. Great question.
Yeah.
So creating the entrepreneurial environment. I have basically a two-factor model of all economic growth, which is basically you need a set of rules that are relatively business friendly. And sort of sensible, and you need education. Those are the two critical elements. And at the local level, my mantra is typically attract and train smart people, and then get out of their way. Now, what does that mean in terms of things that that city governments are responsible for doing? Well, part of it is attracting smart people, and attracting, that's not laissez-faire. This is not a sort of classic Milton Friedman Chicago thing. This is about having safe streets. This is about, maybe having a congestion price, as Stockholm does, to actually make sure that your roads are passable. This is about making sure that your urban spaces are relatively cared for, making sure that you have a city where actually people want to come. And indeed, if I think about cities post-COVID, this sort of urban livability agenda feels really important. Now, and that urban livability agenda is actually aided by entrepreneurship, right? Every time you have an entrepreneur who opens up a beautiful cafe, they're actually making the city itself a more joyful and attractive place. But what about the other half? What about not getting in their way? Well, this is about making sure that you have a relatively sensible set of permits, requirements, and regulations. In the US, and I'll just speak for the US, the outrageous thing is that America makes it so much easier for rich people to become entrepreneurs than for poor people to become entrepreneurs, right? Rich people typically become entrepreneurs in cyberspace, right? Where you can start your own internet phenomenon, perhaps in your Harvard College dormitory, and have 1 billion users before a regulator knows that you exist. By contrast, if you wanted to start a grocery store 5 blocks away and sell milk products, you would have 15 permits to get through in order to get that. All of those permits are functioning at the local level in the US. So that will differ from country to country, but all of these little things which just grind down, right, your ability to actually get a business started, especially a business that operates in the real world as opposed to cyberspace, those are handled at the local level. But you're right, it's also about land use, right? Land use is about the space for the business, but it's also about where are your workers going to live, right? How are they going to actually afford living in this area? And so in a place like Silicon Valley, and Debbie was just alluding to this, right, where, starter homes begin at $4 million, right? There's only one industry where you can really be an entrepreneur, because it's impossible to hire the sort of ordinary workers that you need in most other industries to thrive. Again, that's a hyper local thing. Those rules are not set at the national level at all. So it's really about the things that local governments typically have control over are the rules that stymie entrepreneurship and the quality of life aspects that are crucial in attracting entrepreneurs. So those are the two things that I see as being critical to the entrepreneurial agenda at the local level.
Okay, thank you. Do you want to add something a bit to this one?
No, it's largely the same. And I just think that in addition to that, we look at some of, we look at how much money was thrown at a firm like Theranos. And you've got to wonder if some of those investors were to offer alternative housing or land use arrangements or incentives at a local level, the return would probably be higher than what they're going to walk away from after the Theranos case.
Yeah.
So I think what Ed just said, I would echo the same.
And I think also, I like the point you made there about the difference between, let's say, a cyberspace entrepreneur and a local entrepreneur. I think, would you agree with it? It also would be fair to say that, in a sense, lower educated and poor people are more exposed to the local framework conditions, in a sense, because after all, if you have a college degree and so on, you're more mobile. So just, if you look in Sweden, for example, you have a very clear, let's say, directed sorting where you go to university somewhere and you typically end up in Stockholm, Gothenburg, and Malmö to start a labor market career. Your education gives you a freedom of choice. If you don't have education and you're more, let's say, stuck in your local environment, that also means that you're more exposed to the local environment. You cannot, let's say, vote with your feet to the same extent. Would you agree on that from a user perspective as well? Did you hear that?
Yes, I do agree with that. The education is a crucial complement of entrepreneurship, and cities are places in which we sort of escape and we find our future. And I think Debbie did a beautiful job sort of conjuring the sense of connection in urban areas.
Yes. Okay. We have a question from the audience. I don't know if you see the audience there. Maybe you just.
I don't see the audience. But...
Pontus, I give the word to you.
Thank you, Pontus Brownian, professor in economics. I guess that entrepreneurs are drawn from both sort of ends of the distribution. So you have the highly educated, you have the poor people. But here's my question to Ed. As you have shown in your research and presented today, we see an increase in urbanization. Large cities become even larger, and that means that they should be hotbeds for entrepreneurial endeavors, for new ideas, etc. But at the same time, which has been shown by, for instance, John Haltivanger, who gave his presentations a couple of years ago, you see a decline in entrepreneurial activities and in entrepreneurship as such, new firms. And the same pattern seems to prevail in Europe as well, shown by Ving Nord and others. You also see an increase in concentration at markets, particularly in the US. So my question is, how do you reconcile these two pictures, so to speak? Right.
Great. So the change in the level of urbanization in the US and EU over the last 30 years has been actually pretty small. So it's not as if we've gone from being largely rural places to being largely urban places since 1980. But what has happened in 1980 is, since 1980, is exactly what Manker-Olson predicted would happen, which is, at least I'll just say for the US, we have become increasingly, dominated by insiders at the expense of outsiders. And so if you think about Manker-Olson's Rise and Decline of Nations, let me see if I have a copy here. I may or may not. But Manker was writing about, I think this is my copy. Rise and Decline of Nations. I actually wrote an introduction to the new edition, Economic Growth, Stagflation, and Social Rigidities. Olson's classic sort of claims that in any stable society, insiders figure out increasing ways to make things difficult for outsiders, to make things difficult for disruptors, who will, in some sense, jar what they have. Now, when I first read this book in graduate school 35 years ago, it seemed to me that this wasn't describing America of the 1980s. Maybe he got New York City right, but this wasn't Texas, this wasn't the Sun Belt, this wasn't even California, which it seemed like there were entrepreneurs all over the place. 35 years later, I think he was completely prescient, because I have seen in community after community in the US, new rules come forward which make it more and more difficult to actually break change, to actually create new things. This tends to make America a far more static and siloed place, not just because you can't start your company, because, in Detroit, the existing restaurateurs have made it impossible for a food truck to get started, but you also can't move to opportunity, right? If we look across America's areas, the areas that promote the most upward mobility have also been those areas that have created the most rules preventing new land development, new construction. And so that stops people from escaping from areas. You'll remember my presentation, I started with this map of America with this great jobless area. Why are they staying in Eastern Kentucky? Why are they staying in West Virginia? Well, one reason is the housing is really cheap. And in many cases, it's really cheap because they're living in their parents' homes. I mean, 35% of prime-age men in the US who are jobless are actually living with their parents, right? And they can't afford space in Silicon Valley. They can't afford space in Boston. And the difficulty of building, which has been created by local homeowners who have become increasingly adept at making it really difficult to actually get anything through, have basically killed off American dynamism and have put a real barrier on American entrepreneurship. So that's certainly how I see these two phenomena as coexisting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for your presentation, Christian Ketels from Harvard Business School. We had you a couple of years at our seminar over on the other side of the river. The US is engaged in a big industrial policy experiment at the moment with the IRA and the CHIPS Act. And the CHIPS Act has a strong locational component. The Tech Hubs program is a part of that, which really tries to kind of create innovation hubs, entrepreneurial hubs outside of Boston and the Silicon Valley. What is the advice that you would give from your perspective on your research on innovation, entrepreneurship, and cities to those type of programs? Is it likely to succeed? Could it make it more likely to succeed and help sort of secondary cities succeed in this game?
I am extremely skeptical that Washington, D.C. has the ability to engineer entrepreneurship at the local level. I understand the politics completely of this, right? And if you're going to sell anything about technology to, the American Senate, it needs to be about creating some sort of spatial equity. But I think the thing that works best, in my view, is communities that compete to attract entrepreneurs and to try and create in their own way atmospheres that are good for them. I think it is totally reasonable for the federal government to be engaged in supporting education across the US and even in some sense entrepreneurship across the US, as long as that's sort of a spatially neutral broad policy with appropriate federal tax policies and appropriate national regulations. But the idea that Congress is going to pick a few spots and going to say, oh, this is where we're going to see the next Silicon Valley and we're going to decree it by congressional fiat, that just seems totally implausible to me. We have I wrote a paper on this for, there's an entrepreneurship thing that the National Bureau does that Josh Lerner got me to do. And this was a response to a book that David Otter and Jonathan Gruber and Simon Johnson had written, which has some of these ideas in it. And I think the track record of, the track record of our National Science Foundation of trying to seed, centers of intellectual excellence outside of core areas is just dismal. I mean, we have 70 years of this that they've been trying to do it, and they've been catastrophic from start to finish. So, that may have been necessary to get the bill through, and maybe the bill has some things which are good, but I'm very skeptical about this particular part of the bill.
Okay. I have one more question I would like to ask or raise. I'm not sure is it a question that might be difficult to answer, but anyway, I mean, when you look at the research on urban economics, and also if you look at the statistics and how the economy has evolved, I mean, what we know is that aggregation economy is one of the drivers of the making firms and people clustering in cities, is that they have a very strong skill bias, right? So we can so it's one of the explanation for why we have a rising wage inequality in cities. And I just wonder, I mean, to what extent do you see the rising wage inequality? Of course, it might be a problem depending on how you see it, but is there any way around this, or is this like a natural part of, let's say, the structural change that have occurred, coming with exactly the point you made, right? I mean, the digital technologies increasing the returns to innovation, increasing the returns to skills, making, if you get an idea that is good, you have the world for that idea, making the returns very, very big. And that's simply more or less by definition something that you don't have in let's say, the classic trades, or let's say Main Street or Main Street entrepreneurship, so to say. So my question is basically the rise in inequality that some economists describe as a problem, some describe as, well, it's a new reality and we have a hard time fixing it. I mean, should cities worry about it? If you see anything cities can do, should they do anything? Or is it sort of part of the, let's say, structural change and the economic dynamics that we have witnessed so far?
It's a crucial question, an incredibly important question. So I'll first of all, I'll just make a conceptual point, and then I'll dive further in. I am very unworried about the inequality at the very top end of the tail. I think making sure that, allocating money from Bill Gates to me makes no sense to me. I don't see, he seems to be doing perfectly sensible things with his money. I often do unwise things with my money. It doesn't seem like it's a very sensible thing to be sorting out between relatively privileged people. What I worry about is poverty. What I worried about is joblessness. What I worried about is the lost human potential that exists in the bottom, choose your part of the dimension. And that I worry about a lot. And tragically, the work of Raj Chetty has found that in many American cities, urbanization is not associated with upward mobility. It's associated with the opposite. And that is absolutely something that cities need to worry about, and we as countries need to worry about as well. One thing that's hard for cities to do, or I think in general that cities should not do, is just straight out redistribution at the city level is unwise, right? Because it's just too easy for rich people to exit. And if you try to run a local safety net, right, as cities did in the US in the 1970s, you find that your companies have just fled. The right level to do whatever your safety net is at the national level, right? The right level is to do it at a larger spatial level. And I think certainly you want a smart national safety net that makes sure that people don't suffer. You want to do something that actually takes care of your poorest residents, and make sure that there's some degree of material comfort there. Now, I do think it is, in light of what I said earlier about joblessness, it's worthwhile emphasizing that most of the data we have suggests that being a relatively low-income worker is much better than being jobless in terms of misery, in terms of unhappiness, in terms of opioid use, in terms of family dissolution, and all of these things. Sort of joblessness just looks terrible, in part because a job is much more than an income, right? A job is a sense of purpose. A job is a social connection. Even if you don't actually feel like you've got a vocation, at least you've got your buddies who are with you at the fast food area. And so that's a really important thing that we need to take into account. That means having a welfare system that actually encourages rather than discourages work. That's not impossible at all. right? It's quite easy to imagine ramped up employment tax credits that support people creating jobs. But I think that's sort of an important thing when I think about the national safety net, is to make sure that you make work pay rather than discouraging work. And I think about this in the space of, for example, disability insurance, where Magnus Malmsted's work on the Norwegian experiments with disability insurance showed that if you let the disabled keep more of their earnings, they will work more and their lives will typically get better. And so that's just one of the many examples. Now, what can cities do about the opportunity agenda? Here, I think entrepreneurs play a role. And this point that I made earlier about regulating the entrepreneurship of the poor more than we regulate the entrepreneurship of the rich, that's a big deal. And sort of eliminating that. Secondly, if we ask why cities in the US are so related to low levels of upward mobility for kids, but not for adults. Okay, so an adult who comes to a city typically will experience faster wage growth than elsewhere. A kid will not. One of the things that seems to be different in the lives of adults and the lives of kids in urban areas is that adults actually, even if they wake up in a relatively isolated area, in an area that's relatively poor, they typically work in an integrated company. They work in a company in which they're surrounded by people of all sorts of different skill levels. And I think that mixing, and Debbie was just beautiful in her language about this, but I think it's the mixing of those companies, just like the mixing of the cities, that is sort of part of making cities engines of opportunity. By contrast, especially in American cities, kids who wake up in a segregated neighborhood will go to a segregated school, will play with segregated friends, they'll live a life that is, almost rural levels of isolation. And that is something I think that cities can fight against. They can fight against segregation at the school level. They can fight against segregation at the neighborhood level. They can try to create the kind of sort of mobility through smart housing programs. I mean, it's not clear if you don't have a housing program, it's not clear that you want to start one, but if you do have one, try to do one that doesn't lead to excess segregation. So I think that's another thing that cities can work on to try to make sure that they are as healthy as they can be. Crime is also part of this. Crime is often handled at the local level. And the US certainly, while the decline in crime rates between the 1980s and the 2010s was a great urban triumph, too much of that decline was associated with both massive incarceration of young men and also brutal treatment of people on the street. I'm not a big fan of the defund the police movement, but I am a big fan of reforming the American police. And reforming the American police means we have a much smarter policy about sentencing people, and we have police that treat everyone with respect, as well as protecting protecting people from crime. That unfortunately require actually more spending on police, not less spending on police.
Okay, thank you. Well, do we have any more questions from here? No. Well, with that, I see we have some questions over the internet. Do you see this question, Ed? Can I ask you that?
Do I see this question? I do not see any. Let me see. I think a question on. I'm having trouble reading it. Can someone else read it?
I can read it. So there's a question over the webinar chat. And the question is like this. What has the growth of Zoom, Teams, YouTube, TikTok, Jamboard changed the role of Marshallian knowledge in the air, tacit type of knowledge argument? Since there's a change in both soft infrastructure and capabilities, important elements for the geography-based innovation pattern. I'm sorry, I couldn't myself. Anyway, so I guess the point is Zoom, Teams, YouTube, TikTok, and other types of electronic information and communication services that were increased, that we started using in more ways during the pandemic. Has it changed the Marshallian type of knowledge spillover argument?
So it's too soon to tell, but I have been thinking about this issue though for 30 years. Again, I was responding to Alvin Toffler's The Third Wave in a sense when I first worked on this in 1994. I wrote a paper with Jess Gasper asking the question: are electronic interactions complements or substitutes with face-to-face interactions? I took the view that all of these forms of long-distance communication, as we've seen throughout history, typically end up complementing face-to-face interactions more than they end up substituting them, in part because they just create a more interactive world, but also they create a world in which knowledge becomes more valuable and we become smarter by being around other people in cities. And I'll just give you a couple of examples of this. For example, if you think about the technologies that have made the largest difference in terms of long-distance communication, I'll give you one that dwarfs both TikTok and Zoom. the printing press with movable type. Okay, the printing press with movable type is about the biggest long distance information transfer mechanism we've ever had in the world. And, you know, you could have thought, and people did think in 1500, that the big effect would be of the printing press would be allowing rural pastors, rural priests to read the Bible more easily, to have a Bible. And that certainly was true. And you might have thought this would mean, oh, well, cities don't need to exist because the pastors can read their Bibles without having to come to the city to do this. Well, sure. But the larger effect was the printing press just changed the world. It was one of these things that created a vastly more information intensive world, a vastly more interactive world. And, you know, that made cities more, not less important. The telephone. People thought 120 years ago the telephone was going to make cities unnecessary, was going to make offices unnecessary. Turned out that telephones were used much more by people who were going to see each other face to face than the people who were at long distances. Again, complement rather than substitute. And again, you know, what's happened with, you know, we can watch this stuff with business travel, at least until the pandemic. Business travel far from going down, despite the rise of faxes and electronic interactions, was actually going up. And of course, then finally, there's Silicon Valley, which, you know, should have had the best access to electronic interactions, and yet they specialized in face-to-face interactions. So I don't know. You know, Zoom is a new world, and it's possible that you know, this will finally become a substitute. At least it has been in the very short run. But I think in the long run, we are a social species, and it's very hard for new technologies to overrule 5 million years of evolution that has made us a face-to-face creature.
Sorry. Well, I certainly agree on that, and I think most here in the room do. Okay, so with that, I think we actually are in a position where we can close the seminar. So very much thank you, Professor Ed Glaeser. Wonderful presentation, wonderful talk. Thank you, Debbie Stromsky. Wonderful commenting and reflections on Ed's presentation. And also I thank you, the audience, for your participation. And I also thank you who are in the audience over Zoom. Thank you for participating. Okay, so.
Thank you all, especially thank you, Debbie. Bye-bye.